Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Nelson, and I'm Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts here at the National Gallery of Art. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2023 Wyeth Lecture in American Art, which will be presented by Roberto Tejada, Hugh Roy, and Lily Kranz-Cullen, Distinguished Professor at the University of Houston. Part of the National Gallery's initiatives in Latinx art and its study, today's lecture is the latest in a series of manifestations to take place over the next couple of years devoted to different aspects of the field. We firmly believe that Latinx art is central to the National Gallery's mission, as well as to the study of art history, architecture, and visual culture in academia, museums, and in the world at large. I was actually talking to Roberto this morning, right now, and I was like, I know we met in LA, when was it? And he said, oh yeah, 2008. And so I've known Roberto since 2008, and I felt like I've just always known him. He's the author of poetry collections that include Why the Assembly Disbanded, Full Foreground, Exposition Park, and Mirrors for Gold. His 2019 book, Still Nowhere is in an Empty Vastness, is a Latinx poetics attuned to colonial settlements and cultural conquest, intersections of history and metaphor in art and writing of the Americas. A translator, editor, essayist, art historian, and cultural critic, Roberto's regional, transnational and diasporic research and creative interests involve the language arts and image worlds of Latin America, including Mexico, Brazil, the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, and other sites of U.S. Latinx cultural production. His writing addresses the political imagination and impurity of time in shared image environments, the configuration of art, life, and language inclined to the future. Roberto's groundbreaking work has been recognized with numerous fellowships and grants, including awards from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Fulbright Foundation, Creative Capital Warhol Foundation, Fundação Armando Alves Penteado in Sao Paulo, as well as the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute and the Oakley Center for the Humanities and Social Sciences at Williams College. Between 1987 and 1997, Roberto lived in Mexico City, working as an editor of Violeta magazine, the cultural monthly published by the late Nobel laureate Octavio Paz, and as executive editor of Artes de Mexico, a quarterly detailing pre-conquest to the contemporary Mexican art. He founded the multilingual literary journal Mandorla, New Writing from the Americas, co-edited with Christian Dijkstra and Gabriel Bernal Granados. The publication featured innovative writing in its original language and high-quality translations of existing material, together with visual art and other forms of critical inquiry. Roberto has taught at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, known as UNAM, Dartmouth College, the University of California, San Diego, the University of Texas at Austin, Southern Methodist University, Naropa University, and Bard College, including before his present appointment in Houston. I am grateful for the extraordinary team that brought together today's lecture. In particular, I would like to thank Peter Luckhardt, Kyra Cabañas, Sarah Battle, Theo Pugh, and Jen Rakowski. I would also like to acknowledge the help of our colleagues in visitor experience. Today's lecture is made possible through the generous support of the Wyeth Foundation for American Art. The Center's Wyeth Lectures and Symposia first began 20 years ago in 2023, and I'm grateful for the Foundation's longstanding generosity, which is key to the Center's research and programs. I'm so thrilled that Roberto's here with us today. I'm really happy. And without further ado, I would like to invite him to the lectern.
Thank you, Stephen, for those very generous remarks. And I want to extend my thanks to Peter Luckhardt as well, Kyra Cabañas, Jen Rakowski, and Sarah Battle for your support and generous welcome. And to all of you here today and online, I'm grateful for your proximity and attention, two qualities central to my remarks today. And so I begin. In his early 2000s cheerleader series, multimedia artist Luis Gisbert employed what he called a mutable pop icon, long fetishized in US culture and media, but in configurations that defy the laws of gravity. Suspension wires allowed some of his models portrayed as cheerleaders in typical outfits, but donning rap video bling, to levitate in defiant appreciation of art historical antecedents. These large format photographs understood what powers the circuitry of image making in today's cultural ecosystem, where aesthetic and market values loop mutually to conspire and enable through social and cultural sampling. Miami-based and Cuban-American, Gisbert has produced works that give full play to social identities in representation and to the material basis of subcultures when they become the visual commodity for art world consumption. Viewers are given to register the ethnicity and race of these models in legible scenes of variation, ambivalent tableaux that rearrange hip-hop visuality, Baroque display, and the grammar of advertising, while deranging the ideologies of racial fixity or of racial mixing and its hierarchies, both systems that resulted from colonizing projects in the Americas, each enforcing proximity and assimilation to whiteness. These images also activated, as for Latinx's today, the backdrop or green screen of racial understandings from different countries of origin in Latin America, as overlaid onto a social field of racial and ethnic inflection, ungrounded as an order of stable meaning. At stake in these photographs is what cultural critic Ed Morales, in his Anatomy of Latinx, has called a language that contests the US-American racial binary and privileges racial and sexual difference, while being open to critiques of class oppression. These images by Gisbert serve as a counter-discourse to neoliberal multiculturalism, as a marketing appeal to the so-conceived ethnic consumer, and as a starting point to track the development of interconnected instances in the history of art that relates geopolitical narratives and frameworks for Latinx experience in the United States. For example, based in San Juan, Puerto Rico, since the mid-1990s, the artist duo Alora and Calzadilla compress sweeping histories of the colonial enterprise into material analogies, assemblages, and counterparts. Their work points to the irreversible episodes of conquest beginning in 1511 on the island that is now Puerto Rico, and the ongoing attributes of colonization owing to a vicious European-imposed economy. Sylvia Wynter reminds us that it was this initial large-scale, one-sided accumulation of lands, wealth, power, and unpaid labor by the West that was to provide the basis for the exponential disparities thereafter throughout the hemisphere, even centuries later, in the wake of Latin American independence from Spain and Portugal. That disparity gave way to both material effects and geopolitical consequences. In an expanding world market, guano became a highly valued commodity for its properties as fertilizer. The United States Guano Island Acts of 1855 gave US citizens the legal foundation and commercial incentive for the peaceable possession of land and resources beyond the political boundaries of the nation. In this capacity, any such unclaimed island, rock, or key may, in the language of the Acts, at the discretion of the President, be considered as appertaining to the United States. Financial speculation led to conflicts between nations, and Spain began to plunder the guano found on the Mono and Monito Islands of Puerto Rico, including deposits of back guano found in the island's caves. In Manifest, Alora and Calzadilla produced two massive wall reliefs that use for a cast an actual ship engine manufactured by the U.S. Crowley Maritime Cargo Corporation. There are two versions, 2017 and 2021. The artist created two molds shaped from the bisected engine, each cast in bat and bird guano, other substances, and solidifying agents. Displayed in proximity or side by side, the resulting reliefs were each a tumult in suspended state, burnt umber or ash gray in color, caked in surface values, and though chiefly odorless, suggesting the tang of nitrogen, potash, and phosphoric acid, fertilizer. The severed shapes of the engine, bedplate, girders, frame, and connecting pipes coalesced into prodigious totems that gave way to a devotional mood, even as the two parts of a whole exposed the materials once entangled in the dirty web of economic life. Manifest performed a worlding of the alleged autonomy of the artwork, exposing the guano industry associated with U.S. expansionism, and likewise the authority of individualism and entrepreneurship as a myth inseparable from the global relations on which it depends. Cultural theorist Lisa Lowe has examined how free trade as a liberal universal category concealed the interdependence and historical complicities with, she writes, settler colonialism in North America and the West Indies and the African slave trade, as well as with the importing of Chinese and South Asian indentured labor. The global network she portrays as the intimacies of four continents. Conditions that collapsed the commerce and occupation led to the Spanish-American War, the U.S. occupation of Puerto Rico, and the final evacuation of Spanish troops from the island on October 18, 1898, when the American flag was hoisted by the U.S. Army over the public buildings and forts of San Juan. The colonization of the Caribbean and Americas, with its present-day vestiges, endures as a persistent theme for Latinx artists who seek to address the political and ecological catastrophes that constitute the contemporary condition. This corpus of Latinx art can be seen as a crossway of intersecting cultural and social attributes, intimacies of dislocation that inflect a dissenting perspective and that overturns the casual or cursory cultural account. No single set of artists can typify the multiple unifying experiences that inform Latinx art and its development from the social movements of the 1960s and 70s, and that gave visual legitimacy to forms of ethnic affirmation. But by contesting the structures of power for which Latinx as a category is convenient, and by often rejecting the contemporary corporate expediency and progressive limitations of Latinidad as a general marker, Latinx artists are well suited to interrogate U.S. ascendancy and resist the narrative seductions that deem the market as the only legitimizing institution for art making, while rejecting group affiliations that underwrite or perpetuate forms of U.S. American exceptionalism. These conjugations estrange with the ontological plurality that Roman de la Campa specified as emergent in accounts from more than one American imaginary. That is, the variety of national origin, racial, or ethnic experience among the Latinx diaspora. Latinx artists are inclined to a poetics of history that grapples at the material and visual level with colonial consequences while offering storylines in an alternately affirmative imagination. I turn then to the Texas-Mexico borderlands, to the work of veteran maker Celia Alvarez Munoz, and three Houston-based artists to rehearse an intergenerational frame of meaning for colonial residues unearthed from the past in present-day conceptual and performance practices. They examine that vernacular gap that Kobena Mercer called the entangled space in which popular and official worldviews are constantly antagonized in shifting patterns of authority and subversion. One of these entangled spaces appeared in the context of 1992 and the barrage of international events organized to celebrate the dubious 5th centenary of the discovery of America. Among them, for example, the National Gallery's sprawling exhibition, Circa 1492, art in the age of exploration. The climate also gave rise, by contrast, to the traveling exhibition Countercolonialismo, its title a play on the Spanish name for Columbus. A manual for cultural activism, I urge you to take a look at this someday, How To 92, Model Actions for a Post-Columbian World, whose collective authorship included art critic Lucy Lepard, as well as the Native American counter-quincentenary that led to the Quito Declaration and to a summit held by the Indigenous Alliance of the Americas on 500 years of resistance. Artist Celia Alvarez Munoz produced a work for a corresponding exhibition at the Mexican Museum in San Francisco entitled The Chicano Codices, Encountering Art of the Americas. According to guest curator Marcos Sanchez Tranquilino, the exhibition's aim was to reinstate the indigenous art form of the Codex as a contemporary Chicano artistic medium, while symbolically gathering the dispersed and destroyed pre-Hispanic picture books of the Americas. Alongside works by Amalia Mesa Baines, Gronk, Delia Montoya, and Harry Gamboa Jr., among others, Alvarez Munoz created an installation that manifested her well-established practice of combining wall drawings, narrative texts, and photographic prints. In Petrocoatl, Aztec god del fin del mundo, the artist provided visual centering in the polychrome wall drawing of a fictional Aztec god, Petrocoatl, loosely configured to resemble depictions in the Barbonicus Codex, a document that featured images of Mexica gods in full regalia, among them Xipitotec, Huitzilopochtli, and Tlaloc. Petrocoatl was drawn in solid volumes highlighting his deep brown skin and in a kneeling position. His attributes included a green and red feathered ritual cape and headdress, as well as a shield with a front-facing skull design and an apron with a black oil drop referencing the petroleum industry. Uniquely covering Petrocoatl's entire head and face was a protective gas mask equipped with a respirator, as though the deity were prepared or preparing for chemical, nuclear, or biological disaster. To his right was a black vinyl sans serif wall text relating the following parable, voiced in a persona that registered the adult recollection of childhood reverie. Grandmother was years ahead of her time. She said when I was quite young, "This world will not reach the year 2000. I remembered this fact every year during Lent when the sky in midday looked like fire from hell, and I used a bandana to cover my face from the desert sandstorms walking to and from school. The prediction resurrected not too long ago when a crew of gas company workmen accidentally unearthed an old Aztec god right in the heart of Mexico City. Had this incident occurred when I was a child, undoubtedly I would have asked, how long and how often will he wear the mask?" Suspended to the left of the Petrocoatl drawing were two framed photographs. One pictured an actual object, a feathered gas mask and respirator, enshrined against a fiery pink background. The other was a page appropriated from a 1980 issue of National Geographic, dedicated to the Aztecs. The magazine page depicted, in the metaphor offered by Mexican archaeologist Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, a ghost of the past, a semi-transparent rendering of the Great Temple looming over its ruins in an aerial photograph of downtown Mexico City. This ensemble work by Alvarez Munoz related the devastations of conquest and colonization to folkways in the measure of cosmological time, and to the ancestral future preservations of human life. Reconfigured and reinstalled in 2020 at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic that each day devastated on a global scale, in Petrocoatl, an elder's uncanny prediction now contended with the systemic return of catastrophic history, a persistence of the colonial remainder, and its compulsion to repeat. The artist's understanding of mutuality and interdependence between geological epoch, family descent, and potential planetary destruction resonated in 2020 with corresponding activism like that of Indigenous Action Media. In Rethinking the Apocalypse, an indigenous anti-futurist manifesto, the authors, who self-describe as dreamers dreamt by our ancestors, pose the life or death questions on which the anti-colonial imagination and anti-settler future depend. They write, colonialism is a plague. Capitalism is pandemic. It's apocalyptic. It is an apocalyptic that colonizes our imagination and destroys our past and future simultaneously. We are the antibodies. Latinx artists are uniquely positioned to be in cross-cultural and inter-ethnic conversations that so convey distinct but interrelated experiences of history in the Americas as to wager provisional, future-oriented accounts owing to the hemisphere's colonial past. Recent work by Texas-based makers have examined the geopolitical relations of power in scenes past and present determined by U.S., American, and transnational policies. The globalization played out, for example, on the Texas-Mexico border, a site for critical approaches to U.S. racial logic and the variables of embodiment that specify Latinx experience in contemporary art practices. Maybe it begins and ends with soil and ashes, with biomass and human remains, maybe with tinted window glass and burnt rubber traces on the urban pavement. In a conceptual practice whose material basis too requires the use of a respirator mask, Adriana Corral incinerates assorted documents, including printed copies of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That historical document, collectively crafted and adopted in 1948 by the United Nations General Assembly, affirmed the inherent dignity owed to all members of the human family as being the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Though not legally binding, the Declaration's articles avow the protection of inalienable rights under a universal rule of law meant to inspire local government jurisdiction, that is, the right to life, liberty, and security of person. The document exists concretely and most readily as a digital file in sans serif font available from the United Nations website for anyone to download and print on paper. Corral began to incorporate burnt paper ashes in her practice after serving as an auditor at a United Nations working group session on enforced and involuntary disappearances. The artist was born in El Paso, like Celia Alvarez Munoz before her, and raised along the El Paso-Ciudad Juarez borderland. She became witness to the gruesome media accounts of spectacular violence, the systemic rape, torture, and murder of women in Ciudad Juarez, registered as of 1993. These gruesome gender crimes have been tied to the toxic economy of the Maquiladora factory complex along the Mexican border, to the complicity between law enforcement, transnational criminal organizations, and the unresponsive governments of Mexico and the United States. For Corral, the ashes of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights serve as resilient matter, the name she gives to movement through breath, movement through pain, movement through uncertainty. She turns the material form of immaterial agreements into ash, counterpart to the layers of dust that settles over time in the archive, a substance and pigment that imbues her research-based practice with conceptual claims to the variability and transience of concrete evidence. Resilience is the attribute of persons and actualities subject to overcoming change, of material that serves to speak the dispossessions embedded in the past, but lost to the convenient arcs of official history. Corral uses ash from incinerated paper as both a ceremony of reverence and an act of agnosticism regarding the secular faith in the enforceability of any human agreement. In the site-responsive installation, The Trace of a Living Document, Corral sifted ashes from the Universal Declaration directly onto the concrete floor of the gallery and into 8 4-by-8-foot sifted burial plots, one for each of 8 young women and girls murdered in cotton fields outside of Ciudad Juarez, and 8 ash and gypsum tablets that formed a horizon across the far end wall of the gallery at the University of Texas at Arlington. Here, sifted ashes from the Declaration of Human Rights served as a tenuous material to portray a proper burial in exhibition space, and the perceptual correlative that makes palpable at once the reality of expendable persons, enforced disappearances, vanishing lives, the impermanence of conventions meant to uphold humanity, and the precariousness of legal documents as anything resembling solid ground. Abstractions that subsist in the form of binary code printed on paper so readily flammable as to be reduced in an instant to ashes. Cotton fields invoke gender murders of the present and human rights abuses from the past that an archive can unearth. Corral's research led her to the site of Rio Vista Farm in Socorro, Texas, outside El Paso, a compound originally funded by the Works Progress Administration in 1935 as shelter for indigent, mostly migrant mothers and children. Its architecture, until recently in disuse, had been witness also to the debasement inflicted on Mexican guest workers. In 1942, with deployed in the Second World War, an increased demand for labor, especially in agriculture and the railroad industry, led the United States to enter into guest worker agreements with the government of Mexico in what became the Bracero Program, which lasted from 1942 to 1964 and recruited over 5 million Mexicans to the Southwest United States. Historian Natalia Molina has shown how the depiction of Mexicans as diseased, charity-seeking groups had already given way to U.S. Depression-era deportation campaigns that racialized Mexicans by conflating illness and illegality, thus situating them, she writes, outside the bounds of social membership in the United States and preventing them from remaining in the country at all. Even as the Bracero program allowed Mexican agricultural workers to migrate legally, the fact that the deportations and guest worker solicitations coexisted, she adds, also speaks to the pliability of racial logic. Active at the time, New York photojournalist Leonard Nadel, the son of Austro-Hungarian immigrant parents, had first served in the U.S.-American Army during World War II and later studied at the Art Center College of Design in Los Angeles. From 1956 to 1960, Nadel produced a visual account to confirm the findings of a report, Strangers in Our Fields, published by Ernesto Galarza, California field representative of the Joint United States-Mexico Trade Union Committee. Nadel documented in photographs the conditions of Mexican braceros by following their journey from the processing centers in Monterrey, Mexico, to California and Texas, a total of 64 captioned prints and 1,730 negatives of 35mm film. Nadel's photographs were a response to the bracero testimonies recorded by Galarza. In this camp, we have no names. We are called only by numbers, and what Galarza described as the nearly complete anonymity of all the Mexican citizens who work in the U.S. fields under an agreement between the two nations. By 1955, the Rio Vista Farm labor camp was processing more than 80,000 Mexican workers per year, and they represented 87% of the cotton pickers in Texas, as well as 74% of the workers hired to take care of livestock. Attached to one particularly distressing image he captured, Nadel typed a caption that bore witness to the ways in which workers of Mexican origin were racialized as being fit for labor, but viewed as a disease-bearing menace. He witnessed, much in the same manner and feeling used in handling livestock, upon crossing over the bridge from Mexico to Hidalgo, Texas, the men are herded in groups of 100 through a makeshift booth and sprayed with DDT. Having uncovered these accounts in her research and given the opportunity to work with Black Cube Nomadic Art Museum, a project that reconfines, quote, the place from place to place as a traveling contemporary art museum, producing site-specific artworks in the public realm. Corral developed a bold visual correlative that could enact and stand for the anonymity imposed by the ravages of time and forgetting that so encapsulate an episode of U.S.-Mexico history as to monumentalize those who had been treated as nameless, called only by numbers, and subjected to the life-threatening chemicals used to disinfect their bodies, deemed abject and contaminated. The process-based durational work unearthed, Desenterrado, condensed remnants of what happened in the past, even as it thematized and gave form to the exchanges between the artist and a webwork of social and art world actors. A contemporary art incubator, Black Cube, municipal institutions, the City of Socorro, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and interviews with former bracero Felipe Serrano. The work was a collaborative interaction as well with a family-owned and operated flag company in San Antonio, many of whose Latina workers were commissioned to manufacture the 18 by 30-foot white cotton flag and charged with employing their craft to embroider the double-sided images of a Mexican golden eagle and an American bald eagle, with thread whose pigment derived from the burnt ashes of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 23, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. The act of placemaking involved the engineering that would sustain a 60-foot pole and extended flag whose recto and verso images resembled those of a fading document. Its pages bled through, an undulating choreography recalling the perverse hospitality of neighboring nations. With the white cotton flag on display and visible from both sides of the Ciudad Juarez-El Paso borderlands from March to June of 2018, the resulting work was an unearthing of time and its vicinities, a process, a civic meditation, an exercise in logistics, the marking and making of a place, a duration, a performance for no one in particular, but decisive and ambitious, a binational declaration of a drive to know and give shape to what could have remained unremarked on the landscape or otherwise only as a footnoted reference. Deceptively blank from a distance, as though an act of surrender, truce, or ceasefire, on closer inspection, the barely visible emblems of opposing eagles blur into an indistinct phoenix, rising from the brown and amber of the surrounding cotton fields and dry earth, fading and disintegrating in the winds of place and time, a stand-in for the racialized bodies of guest workers gone by, even as the white flag itself surrendered eventually to the elements, distressed and tattered by half. A diagonal line opens here to the intimacies of lives lived in dislocation, akin to what anthropologist Wendy Vogt describes as a mode of proximity that migration and its consequences can enable. Acts, she writes, involving work, closeness, and exchange within conditions of danger and inequality. Latinx artists embody to one degree or another narratives of family displacement, the severed connections of diaspora, and circumstances that foreground gendered and relational dynamics, power, and the contours of reciprocity that can develop between mobile and sometimes temporarily immobile subjects. This resulting intimacy, at any rate, the possibility of its emergence, proves critical, Vogt adds, in complicating understandings of mobility as a social process and form of resistance against cascading forms of violence. From Rio Vista Farm of the last century to Brooks County and the Brownsville-Matamoros borderlands today, two other artists each explores a differently intimate form of dislocation that migrant bodies call us to consider. The social realities of South Texas first led Angel Lartigue to research the material process of decomposition in view of present-day migrant exhumations occurring in Brooks County, Texas, where the number of recorded migrant deaths has exceeded that of any other Texas county over the last 3 decades. 530 remains, to speak only of the 5-year period between 2012-2019. Lartigue's practice evolved from her relation to the South Texas Human Rights Center, whose mission has been to end death and suffering on the Texas-Mexico border through community initiatives that include systematizing forensic data collection of unidentified human remains and mapping unknown graves in 18 Texas border counties. To this end, Lartigue pursued training at the Forensic Anthropology Center at Texas State University in, she writes, the archaeological method of exhuming human remains from the ground, identifying a burial site, excavating and burial mapping the human corpse. She continues, the 26-acre research facility is used to study the processes of human decomposition on donated cadavers, notably, she adds, and mostly from white cis men. Attuned to the history and particulars of this landscape, Lartigue has created a multi-platform work that interlocks with the practices of drawing, performance, sculpture, and video into a species of trans-bodied counter-colonial folk futurism. She adapts and recombines techniques associated with forensics and archaeology, pre-colonial Aztec forms, including the Zompantli skull rack, depicting the heads of sacrificed war captives, camera-altered images of Mexica figurines, and a Petri dish garment cultured with human cadaver fungi, maggot exoskeletons, and pupae, worn here by one of her collaborators, trans artist Farah Fong. The Petri dishes are a kind of Zompantli skull rack. Lartigue's 2018 Operation Psychopomp was a ritualistic rogue science performance staged at a queer nightclub in Houston. The work, she relates, in a research paper entitled Science at the Club, Putrefaction as an Artistic Medium. As part of a layered and multi-platform installation work, Water Moon, featuring photographs, video projection, and soundscape, she activated the space of a shrine and pilgrimage site devoted to the late 1800s curandero, Don Pedro Jaramillo, known to followers as the healer of Los Olmos, situated in Brooks County and at his burial place outside Falfurrias, Texas. In a 2022 performance, captured in the camera work of fellow artist Tere Garcia, footage later incorporated into a performance and installation at Houston's Diverse Works, featuring a bust of Don Pedro Jaramillo designed in collaboration with Nadine Nazar. Lartigue inhabits the homespun devotional space seated on a prayer kneeler before an altar sparsely decorated with votive candles, flowers, statuettes of the Virgen de Guadalupe, St. Jude, photographs of Jaramillo, and beyond the frame, a wall of handwritten petitions on cards and notes placed by devotees alongside personal mementos and pictures. There, she delivered a subcutaneous injection of estrogen as she re-enchanted the space in her seafoam lycra dress and her futuristic tribal face paint design. The subsequent actions involved moving to mark make on the floor-level paper that doubled as ceremonial space and material support akin to one of her forensic maps depicting a cadaver after exhumation. The estrogen injection performance and floor diagram evoked actual bodies elsewhere in the nearby environs, connecting lines that betray the intimacy between the shrine, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection checkpoint near Falfurrias, the Brooks County Detention Center, and water stations Lartigue helped to replenish in her work with the South Texas Human Rights Center. These spaces obtained, in her words, the materiality of the dead, the understanding of ancestors as living non-human or ahuman forms, and countered the fetishism that perpetuates racial and sexual binaries in current methods of forensic identification that still rely on essentialist models and so neglect, she writes, to identify and determine transgender and intersex human remains. Literary theorist Amanda Ellis writes of the traditional medicine known as curanderismo, where indigenous healing practices subsist in vernacular Catholic expressions of faith. This practice can be, she writes, understood as a decolonial medicine insofar as it effectively deconstructs dualistic constructions of personhood, and it heals wounds not often attended to in the panoptic gaze of biomedicine. Lartigue argues that for queer trans people of color, a survivalist nature takes form as greater threshold for being with the processes of the dead. She equates transitioning to care work that activates a system of analogies. Burial maps of migrant exhumations are to the unearthing of pre-colonial indigenous image worlds, as the intimacy of vernacular faith in the forms arranged around the shrine of Don Pedro Jaramillo are to estrogen injections in the practice of self-curanderismo. But the performance and its references are neither merely private nor speculative. LGBT asylum seekers, especially trans migrants, fleeing gender violence and persecution in their home countries, have been obliged to remain in Mexico on account of the migrant protection protocols established and upheld by the past and current U.S. administrations. While waiting for cases to move through the U.S. immigration courts, according to Human Rights Watch, trans migrants overwhelmingly experience abusive and dangerous conditions in Mexico when not allowed to cross the border to seek asylum, frequently deprived, too, of essential services, including gender-affirming care, crucial to their health and well-being. In her social practice and corresponding performance, Lartigue so animates an open site in the intimacy and quiet of a vernacular shrine as to summon certain oppositions: the biological essentialism that polices the sexual binary in death as in life, the punishing geographic terrain of Brooks County weaponized against the undocumented, a diagonal science that transposes biomedicine into healing, into a ceremony intended to reverse the fetishism that pathologizes the migrant and makes visible the antagonisms that endanger trans asylum seekers. Administered with forensic care, her enactment externalizes the liminal process of transitioning as being akin to those, she writes, bodies that return to other non-human forms. She looks to decomposition of the organism, which is not one, as the undead specter haunting scenes of embodiment. Hailing from Brownsville, Matamoros, and its borderland of the Rio Grande Valley, Veronica Gaona similarly builds a media expansive practice and mobilizes materials that relate the oblique connections of transnationality to the transitory, of diasporic displacement to vernacular architecture, of migrant death to borderland subcultures, that is, around mobile and sometimes temporarily immobile subjects. Sculptures built using Ford F-150 body parts feature embedded photographs and images from her family archive, either visible on the surface or overlaid and indiscernible. The pictures relate a fragmented narrative of a family's mixed citizen status as migrant workers and the movement from San Juan de los Lagos, Jalisco, to Matamoros, Tamaulipas, and further to Homestead, Florida. In Gaona's work, the migrant search for better life, evident in cinder blocks, rebar, car parts, polarized glass windows, and building receipts, convey the materials and patterns that track migrant work in the United States and remittances that finance the building of a family residence under various stages of construction in the uncertain back home across La Frontera. Gaona depicts, in the search for a better death, given the policies that have turned the geography of South Texas into killing fields. That better more dignified death takes the shape of remittance practices known as traslado, that honors the family of deceased migrants with the return of the loved one's remains, requiring the kind of legal recognition from which the departed may or may not have benefited in life, now in the form of a burial transit permit. But the habitus Gauna's work submits also rehearses the communal exuberance specified in the tacuache style of troqueando subculture and its truck meet conviviality. To honor the passing of her uncle, David Gomez, Gauna staged iterations of a performance titled Para aquellos que no regresan en la vida, siempre está la muerte. For those who do not return in life, there is always death. In the parking lot of Houston's Lawndale Arts Center, Elijah Jimenez, a professional mechanic and friend of the artist, approaches a black Ford F-150 and takes the driver's seat. He wears a green and white Mexican national soccer away Adidas jersey, faded blue jeans, canvas belt, a silver chain, wraparound sunglasses, and cowboy boots. Gauna choreographed the performance to feature references both to burial rituals and to the tacuache youth culture energized around corrido tumbado, music made by recording artists Nathaniel Cano, Fuerza Regida, Yvonne Galaz, and Junior H., among others. A fusion that blends the traditional instrumentation of northern Mexican conjunto with elements of trap and house music. The vibe of a typical corrido tumbado alludes to working-class culture and urban borderland life with a ground-level philosophy that conjugates romantic attachment, the desire for commodities that signify U.S.-American success, and local occasions for the display of renewed Mexican-descendant cultural affirmations that rely also on TikTok and YouTube connectivity. Fuerza Regida frontman Jesus Ortiz Paz asserts that Mexicans from Mexico used to look down on those of us from the States. We're hood, but we are Mexican. We deserve respect. And Nathaniel Cano admits, people from Mexico didn't always respect us, but now they're interested in how we do things. We like hip hop, we like lowriding. What we do is working. For the Diverse Works performance at Lawndale Arts Center, flowers were provided by community members and arranged in the bed of the Ford pickup, a stand-in for the deceased. The truck's tinted cab window bearing the uneasy phrase of the title in Old English font, white vinyl lettering. Para aquellos que no regresan en la vida, siempre está la muerte. Introduced by Diverse Works curator Ashley De Hoyos, the action gave way to the driver revving up in circles around the Lawndale parking lot that served as a surrogate donut pit. Strains of Junior H's track 100,004 kilómetros emanated from the truck's sound system, Sé que la vida no ayuda, I know the distance is no comfort, as Elijah Jimenez proceeded to perform a sequence of 4 burnouts of the kind associated with troqueando proficiency. The video register captured the disjunction between sight and sound, of course, but between the burnout smoke as proxy for incense and the burnt rubber tread marks as a placeholder for the traslado of human remains over distances that dissolve in the statelier service of a homeland burial. With tires unleashing smoke and leaving burnt rubber traces for those who do not return in life, the staging evoked a circular or meanwhile experience to mirror migratory expectations. It displaced the high art frame of performance with a similar ritual of shared affiliation, competitive skill, cultural allegiance, and in-group sociability. Gaona closed the circle, so to speak, between the traslado, there's always death, we deserve respect, and the avowal of cultural kinship, whatever we do is working, as confirmed in the art spaces and at a truck meet. Obtained in these works is the diagonal line of proximity and disjunction, suspension wires and levitating, the thwarted social leveling of the same and the uniform, settler designs in the dung-covered engine of a cargo ship, a respirator mask, a codex, the uncanny repetitions of catastrophe in the nursery rhyme imagination, and an ancestor years ahead of her time, paper ashes, a flag for lives lived, and missing history, a threshold ceremony of personhood in the private and public domain. Each aligns with what philosopher Peter Osborne qualifies as a deepening of art's historical and thereby imminently relational character to the level of its mode of existence. These works can be thought of as cutting a diagonal line that suspends an internal and external conflict in so much as they incorporate and convey both a particular set of historical practices experienced by social beings while simultaneously enacting the unity of the process that is its history. Media scholar and curator Chon Noriega notes that in the reception of Latinx art, critics often belabor, quote, the contextual factors that make close visual analysis unnecessary, that make Latino and art irreducible terms. He proposes a genealogy of forms across multiple spaces so that another history emerges, one in which, for Latinos at least, the artwork owes as much to the Baroque and its synthesis with the indigenous practices of and rituals of our America as it does to the avant-garde and postmodern. Noriega's challenge is to begin not with the premise of cultural or racial otherness, that is, to posit Latino as a genre equivalent to its exclusions, but to foreground an analysis of the media particulars that vex the single focus on ethnicity. E. Carmen Ramos similarly argues that the category of Latino art can emerge not as an ethnic outsider embroiled in an intra-group conversation about identity, but as a key participant in a national movement that inflects our historical past in a whole new way. These approaches designate the distinct political and cultural narratives of diasporic movement from Latin America and the Caribbean to the United States, a history marked by U.S. intervention that has in turn driven migration northward. Ed Morales historicizes the attributes held in common by Latin American descendant peoples in the United States, and the problematic categories Latinx, Latina, Latino, Hispanic, or Latine, to the degree that these appointments, quote, tend to erase national, racial, and ethnic differences in a way that is strikingly parallel to the ideology of mestizaje, a mixed-race idealism that in Latin America has often been used to silence the black and indigenous and impose a colorblind order to white-dominated societies. Morales argues that while this criticism is valid because of Latinx's diverse national, ethnic, and racial manifestations, as an ongoing principle, the label still conveys significant meaning and a narrative of shared experience. For some Latinx artists, a critical attitude to practice surfaces from the shared experience with a view to that idealism, to what Lisa Lowe underscored in those articulations that redirect the dominant cultural forms. Its cause is prompted when U.S. American norms and cultural effects fit too comfortably within frameworks canonized by national history, invested in isolated origins and independent progressive development. It bears, too, a family resemblance to what Svetlana Boym once described as diasporic intimacy, whose values, relationships, and archives can be attained only through indirection and intimation, through frameworks unconvinced by transparency, authenticity, or an unexamined sense of belonging, and therefore, she writes, rooted in suspicion of a single home. An intimacy of dislocation is furthered in forms bequeathed by histories of brutality and closeness, of proximity within entangled relations of hierarchy. It begets an unruly consciousness that upends uniformity. It follows with staggering care the material traces that betray the decimating economy of extractive accumulation in a diagonal line that can traverse a family narrative even when it doubles as a critique of environmental catastrophe. It covers the disjunction and closeness that separates the years 1492, 1992, and 2020 in an enigmatic parable about lines of descent, both biological and cultural. The intimacy of dislocation reflects the nature of works that rhyme with the historical process they exhume. That is, they mark the place where substance underlying U.S. American exceptionalism encounters the ashes of allegedly universal agreements, now in the fading hues of disenchantment. It is a distant cousin to the resilience that so tells of movement through breath, movement through pain, movement through uncertainty. No matter the security states that so profit from the willingness of human beings to wager life itself in the name of a promise, they who so seek everyday existence, rid of the precariousness that economic injustice, wartime, and other social terrors dictate, as to be a subcutaneous proximity that eases the demarcation separating neighbor and stranger, biological certitudes, and the lines we believe divide the living from the dead. I have in mind an order that disarticulates a view from its environs, a standard that struggles to fully extend as it ripples against the wind, against the murmur and sonic curvature of oncoming velocities, against the near or receding rumble, a pitch at a plaintive distance, against the high-level clouds pulled back as if from the field below, as though made visible by the occasional clang of hooks against metal. That is, I have in mind the closeness of particulars so disjoined as to make the long duration and discontinuous sweep of experience shareable, if only to the extent that a vivid intimacy of the imagination is able persistently to refute and reconfigure its own forms. Thank you.